Well, good morning. Welcome to Radioactivity. I'm Rob Lorei. Coming up today, we're going to get a preview of a 5-day conference that begins today in Pinellas County. It's designed to challenge the Church of Scientology. Organizers say the conference, which is called Flag Down 2014, will reveal the abusive conditions, financial exploitation, coerced abortions, and broken families that lie behind the Scientology organization's veneer of religiousness. One of the speakers at the conference will be the grandson of the founder of Scientology, Jamie DeWolf, great-grandson of L. Ron Hubbard. Gave a talk last year on National Public Radio, which quickly became an internet sensation. Here's an excerpt.
Every family has their black sheep. On my mother's side, our black sheep was a shepherd who enslaved his own flock. The king of the Khans, a man who made himself a messiah, even though he never called himself a god. Even tonight, his words are written in steel and titanium capsules in a nuclear-reinforced bunker miles underground, so if our whole species goes extinct, his words will still survive. He was a subject we never talked about at the kids' table at family reunions, but he was my great-grandfather, L. Ron Hubbard. Lafayette Ron Hubbard. He was born a storyteller, a science fiction writer, a golden-tongued grifter who could write a book in any genre while the publisher waited downstairs in the hotel lobby. Just another name on dime store pulp mags, paid only a penny a page until 1949 when he said, "You want to know how you really get rich? You start a religion." A year later, he kept to his word, wrote Dianetics, transforming science fiction into fact, until you could pay to flatline your mind for a fee. Overnight, he went from pennies to a profit, until the world demanded to see his evidence. But L. Ron knew if you don't have facts, all you need is faith. So he turned his science into a religion, and Scientology was born. I never met the man who gave me my red hair, the manic depression still twisted in the strains of my DNA, and the first time I saw a psychiatrist, when he asked me if mental illness runs in my family, all I could say was yes. Yes, it does. When I told him my great-grandfather was a cult leader that enslaved the minds of millions, he accused me of having delusions of grandeur. What can I say? It runs in my veins. I've been in secret to L. Ron Hubbard Hollywood life exhibits, where his latest victim leads me on a tour of a life he never led, my family written out of existence. And this disciple will never know the legacy of lies that I still carry in my last name. The wolf, a cover story to protect us from my great-grandfather's true children, the army of empty who greet me in train stations with an e-meter and a personality test, and they ask me if I've ever heard of L. Ron Hubbard. And I want to ask them, which one? The Son or the Father? The God or the man?
Well, it was Jamie DeWolf, the great-grandson of L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of the Church of Scientology, in an excerpt from a talk he gave last year on National Public Radio. And we're going to talk today about Flag Down 2014, which is an event that takes place in Pinellas County this week, and it's sponsored by people who are opposed to the Church of Scientology. We've got three guests in the studio with us. In here is Pete Griffiths, who's a former member of the church. John Sweeney is a journalist. He wrote a book called The Church of Fear Inside the Weird World of Scientology. And Chris Shelton is here, too. And thank you all for coming. It's great to have you here. They're all with Flag Down 2014. And Pete, let me start with you. What's the purpose of this event in Pinellas County this week?
Well, hello, Bob. The purpose, quite simply, is to let people know what Scientology really is. Because there are two perceptions of Scientology. There's what they say they are, and then there's what they actually really are. So we intend to expose fraud, abuse, disconnected families, and all that.
Were you a member of the church at one point?
I was indeed. I was
How
actually an active member for 7 years. Yeah.
Why did you quit?
It's a long story. I actually didn't quit. I got kicked out. But again, that's a long story. So, yeah.
Okay. Was there one thing that you discovered after 7 years in the church that kind of sealed your fate or made them separate?
It was quite interesting, yeah, because what kicked it all off was I organised a fundraiser for Scientology, but the people who were supposed to pay me, that I was then going to pay the venue for, didn't actually pay me, and I couldn't pay the venue. The Scientologists say that I organised a conference for them and walked out halfway through. That's not true. What actually happened was that I didn't get the money from them and couldn't pay the bill. And it really knocked me for six as a Scientologist, because it made me question, why did these people do this to me? I trusted these people. Why have they done this?
Let me go backwards a little bit. Why did you join the church initially?
Initially, I didn't make a conscious decision to join. And that's a tricky one, because I since realized that every person who becomes a Scientologist does decide to do it. You know, you're the one that makes all these decisions, so, you know, you're the one that's ultimately responsible. However, they are experts in coercing you and leading you along a very definite path. I mean, they have it well worked out over the last 60 years. And they take a person from knowing nothing about the subject to becoming a Scientologist. But you have to make those decisions. They are helping you along the way. You are being coerced, influenced, and manipulated at every step.
Let's talk to our second guest, John Sweeney, who's the author of Church of Fear, Inside the Weird World of Scientology. If you look on YouTube and look for John Sweeney and Scientology, you'll see some pretty amazing videos of interactions that he had with the church and also private detectives that were hired by the church. John, welcome to WMNF. Good to have you here.
Good morning, Bob.
And let me ask, I think the switch on your microphone is off. Right at the top, there's a toggle switch there. Yeah.
Right. Yes, there we are. Good morning,
right.
Bob. Sorry about that.
No, John, thank you. Do you work for the BBC, or did you work for the BBC?
I work for the BBC, and everything I'm about to tell you is my own personal views and not those of the BBC. I'm just here kind of on holiday.
Okay.
It's a strange holiday, but then Clearwater is a very strange place.
How many years have you been reporting on the Church of Scientology?
Well, first of all, I want to say very quickly, I'm not and have never been a Scientologist. I'm just simply a journalist who was given a job, go and have a look at the Church of Scientology BBC panorama, and I went nuts. I went absolutely screaming habjabs. I mean, you'd lock me up, I'd lock myself up. Who is that fruitcake screaming at these people? And I would say that the church in some ways did that to me. And one of the people who did follow us around in 2007, me and my BBC team, a guy called Mike Rinder, has subsequently left, and he said, no, we aimed at this. We wanted this to happen.
Mike Rinder was the spokesperson for the Church of Scientology.
Indeed, and also the head of what people say the OSA, which is the version of the CIA. Now, this is the thing which calls itself a religion. By the way, in Britain, where I come from, it's not classed as a religion. It hasn't passed the critical test, at least not yet. Here in the United States it is. But this is a religion which behaves towards critics in some ways as if they have no right to criticise, and that's very strange. I believe passionately that people have a right to believe in anything, and I support that belief. But equally, there is a right to scrutinise, and there's a right to mock and have a laugh at things. Those rights don't you have one right on its own, and that you've got trouble. Recently, I went to North Korea. And I'm fascinated by the parallels between North Korea and Scientology.
So when you began to report on the Church of Scientology, were you out to get them? What was your intention with your first reports?
No, listen, if somebody tells me to go investigate the Church of England, I'd go and do that. But what was weird from the very, very first moment was that suddenly we were conscious of being followed. It was weird. It was creepy. There were little moments like the film The Matrix when suddenly you see the black cat twice, and they said, "Oh, that's a glitch." And what's going on? What's going on? Then suddenly, bang! Tommy Davis, the son of an Academy Award-nominated actress whose bunny got boiled in a film whose name I've forgotten. Tommy Davis and Mike Rinder are in our hotel lobby. It's midnight. and they're waiting for us. And there's a black-clad Scientology cameraman. But we've heard about this stuff before, and we've got our own little camera, and they ambush us, but we film their ambush of us, and we film it all, and it's all in our film. And then there's a car chase in LA, and then we're talking to a critic here in Clearwater, or here in Florida, a guy called Sean Lonsdale, who used to film them, and they used to film him, and for hours and hours, the two cameras would be on each other. It was weird and creepy. Well, they read out, Tommy Davis pops up and reads out his guy's sexual criminal records for having sex with gay men in a public place 10 years before. What kind of religion does that?
Well, let's play a little bit of the sound of one of your interactions with the Church of Scientology. As you're traveling around, you are being followed by the church, and there are a lot of interactions on the videos that people can see on the web. Look for John Sweeney, BBC Scientology on the web. But, John, set this up. What are we about to hear?
So, I apologise then and I apologise now. It's the seventh day, and I've actually said to the producer, I can't do this anymore. And she said, shut up and get on with your job. So I did. They took me to a centre, a museum, which is called the Industry of Death, and it tells the story of psychiatry as if psychiatry was wholly bad. And I had great problems with it. I didn't truly understand the history of psychiatry, so I wasn't able properly to defend psychiatry.
This is in Los Angeles?
This is in LA, and I'm being shown around. We've gone into the Celebrity Centre. They've given us unique access, more access to journalists perhaps than any other journalists have ever got. And there is a moment where I fear I'm losing my grip on reality. And I lost my rag. This is what happens.
And when asked in that case why he kept making the accusation, Sweeney's reaction was unexpected, to say the least.
Brainwashing is a crime against humanity.
You are quoting the second
Right.
Well, that's you screaming, yes. and the person calmly in the background talking about brainwashing is a spokesperson for the Church of Scientology.
Brainwashing is a crime, he's saying. Brainwashing is a crime.
Well, he seems pretty calm. Why were you so upset?
He was, because I'd got to the end of my tether. And because I found it very, very difficult to understand what was going on. And I think I was afraid, and I was genuinely afraid. It felt to me, and this is my own personal perception, it felt to me that they were taking over my mind and they were creeping into my brain, and I had to push back in some way. Clearly, that's desperate. But there are people I've met subsequent. That happened in 2007, and as I say, I apologise then and I apologise now. I really do feel that civilised discourse is part of the engine oil of democracy and an open society. At the same time, what kind of religion is it that pushes people in this way and pushes them and pushes us and pushes them until either it feels like either I had to submit to what they were saying or I fought back and screaming my head off. It's a strange thing.
Do you feel like this person that you were in this exchange with, that he knew how to press your buttons, that he was trained to press your buttons?
Exactly, Bob. Exactly. And what happens 3 years later, there's that film which is on the internet. Both films are on YouTube. The first one is called Scientology and Me. That's when I first lost my temper. And there's a car chase. And all of it's kind of reality wobbles. That's what happened to me. It was the fear of that man's voice. My voice is the fear of the man whose perception of reality is wobbling in front of my very eyes. And my brain felt, I don't think I can handle this. And then 3 years later, Mike Rinder defected. He was a senior Scientologist. And he told us that They knew how to press my buttons, that's their language, and they did it deliberately, and they wanted to disgrace me. John Travolta apparently phoned up, he's a senior Scientologist, along with Tom Cruise. He phoned up the Director General of the BBC 8 times to get me the sack.
But you were never fired?
I was never fired. I still work for the BBC, strange as that may sound. and the Director General was always in a meeting. He's that kind of man.
Well, we're talking about a conference that's going on this week in Pinellas County called Flag Down, and it's sponsored by people who are opposed to the Church of Scientology, and three of the folks are with us right now. Pete Griffiths is a former member, spent 7 years in the church. He's one of the organizers of Flag Down 2014. We just heard the voice of John Sweeney, who's a reporter. He's written a book called The Church of Fear, Inside the Weird World of Scientology, and Chris Shelton is here. Chris, thank you for coming by. Are you a former member of the church?
I am.
And tell us your story.
Okay, so I was raised in a Scientology family, and I became personally involved with it when I was 15 years old. And I joined staff. I started working for the church when I was 17, and I continued that work for 25 years, both at a local church level and then moving up to the C organization, the elite body.
And what cities did you live in? What cities did you
I was
do this
born and
work?
raised in California, so I'm from California, and I joined staff in Santa Barbara, California, where I worked for 8 years, and then I moved to Los Angeles and was basically based out of Los Angeles the time that I was in the Sea Org.
And what was life like in the Sea Org?
Intense, hard, and many times, especially when I was doing a very intensive correction program, prison-like.
Prison-like how?
Well, restrictions on where I could go, who I could talk to. There was a period on that correction program called the Rehabilitation Project Force, the RPF, where I could not even interact with my wife. That went on for 3 years and 3 months. There was no days off. There's no time off. There's no holidays. I mean, Christmas was, an extra 15 minutes for your dinner. Like that was holidays,
When you were 15 and you began this work in the church, were your parents members of the church at that point?
They were at that point, and they're not now.
What happened to you? Why did you leave the church?
Because I saw the signs of corruption and the intense demand for money increasing over the period of time that I was in the church until it became a point where it was obvious that that was all that was being sought was money. And I didn't join up for that. I joined because I wanted to help people. And over the course of the years that I worked for the church, I did help a great many people. And that's what kept me going. People wonder, how do you keep doing something like that for 25 years? Well, because I truly believed in what I was doing and I was good at it. But the orientation of the organization changed over that time. There was always push for money, but to morph that into only money, only fundraising for buildings, for nothing, for no exchange at all, that was wrong. And it just became more and more obvious in my day-to-day activities that I was telling more lies than I was telling truth about what we were about and what we were doing. And I didn't want to be part of that anymore, and that's why I left. And I left in good standing. I actually left the proper way. I didn't just take off one day. And yet, after I left, they actually engaged in a campaign of persecution against me personally, which I found untenable and unbelievable. And it drove me away, and actually they did everything they could to sort of make me an enemy, and so now I'm speaking out.
How did your family relationships go as you were leaving the church? Were you able to keep contact with your wife and your parents? Did those relationships continue?
I divorced my wife because she stayed in the C organization. She's still working for them. My parents, I came to find out after I had left the C organization, had themselves quietly faded off of the church's activity radar. And they were maintaining friendly relations. They wanted to maintain communication with me and didn't want to have the church's policy of disconnection, enforced disconnection, be put into place between me and them. So they never let me know how they really felt about the church.
You talked about the C organization that you worked for as an elite organization, but also you said you felt like you were in prison at times. Would it be fair to say that you think your human rights were violated as an employee, as a member of the C organization?
Yes.
Why would you say that?
Well, I base that off of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which calls for freedom to move, freedom to travel, freedom to communicate, freedom to believe and say and speak what you want. You don't have those freedoms in the C organization. It's a very militant organization. In fact, if you are receiving, orders or commands or things you need to do, or they're going to send you out on some project, or they're going to have you do some new job, and you don't want to do that, well, and you say so, that's called backflash. They call that backflash, and it's punishable. And
what's the purpose of the Sea Organization overall?
The idea is to, what Hubbard says is to get ethics in on the planet, which basically is some sort of idea of removing any obstacles or barriers to Scientology expanding or getting bigger, right? And then he later refined it to getting in the exact degree of Scientology ethics, tech, and policy, so that Scientology, will expand. But basically, it's pretty much anything Hubbard said. Pretty much it.
And now David Miscavige, who's the head of the church.
That's right.
Well, we're talking with members of a group that are organizing a conference called Flag Down. It takes place this week in Pinellas County. Our phone number, 813-239-9663. Our email address is dj@wmnf.org. 3 years ago, I did an interview with Janet Reitman, who wrote a book called Inside Scientology. And after that interview, several spokespeople for the church called up and wanted some time on the air. And I want to play a little bit of what the church side of this controversy is. Reitman's book talked about David Miscavige, the head of the church, who's allegedly obsessed with money. He's obsessed, allegedly, with the sexual lives of his parishioners, has been occasionally violent towards staffers, according to Reitman's book, and that there's a lot of punishment for dissenters and ex-members. So I brought Pat Harney on, who's the public affairs director of the Church of Scientology, and Brett Miller, who's a public member of the church. And here's an excerpt of the interview I did with them in 2011. How many members does the Church of Scientology have?
I don't have an exact figure on that, but it is in the millions.
According to Trinity College, cited in Reitman's book, there are only 25,000 members of the Church of Scientology in the U.S.
Well, that's one. Again, we go back to Reitman and her flawed research sources, because that's ridiculous. Or you only have to look at the various videos and of these churches that I'm talking about, the 17 churches, to recognize that figure is just a ridiculous figure. And that also, by the way, that figure of 25,000 has been disputed by other experts. And even within her book, she cites the figure as closer to like 250,000 per Reitman.
She says that the church is losing members, that many prominent people have decided to leave the church. There is a director, Paul Haggis, who left a few years ago, and that you're not able to keep some of your prominent members, let alone your rank and file members.
Yeah, again, we're talking Janet Reitman and her flawed research. Here's the thing about the church is actually growing exponentially and has been. And if she had actually verified her facts with the church, which, by the way, the church reached out to her to do just that. Like I just gave you an example of L. Ron Hubbard's war record. First page of the first chapter goes into his death, and she says it's 1985 when he actually died in 1986. Shows you that her facts were not verified. She did not try to correct them. And again, it's the same with the growth of the church. It has grown exponentially.
Well, we're talking with members of the Church of Scientology. You're listening to a live interview on WMNF in Tampa. Brett, let me get you in on this. I wonder, have you read the book Inside Scientology? And if you have read the book, what do you think? Alternatively, if you have read the book, would you be considered a suppressive person or an outcast within the church for reading it?
Well, that's actually kind of humorous, Rob. To answer your question, no, I haven't read the book, but I did listen to your interview with Janet from last week. And, it's interesting for me as a practicing Scientologist to listen to someone's opinion who hasn't experienced the religion for itself. And I think that's probably true of any religion. If somebody has an opinion about the Catholic religion, for example, and they can write an objective outside opinion of the Catholic religion. Okay, it's an opinion. And, certainly there's no dogma that prohibits me from reading anything I want to read. I've talked with a lot of folks with a lot of different opinions. just to back up what Pat said from my own reality, I have seen our churches become more and more filled with people over the last 5 years.
Janet said that she went to New York, and she lives in New York at least part of the time, and went to the building, the 7-story building near the theater district, and took some introductory information about Scientology, watched some films, took some counseling. And it wasn't long before members of the church who were counseling her began to ask her for money. First $50 and later $2,000. Can you proceed in the church without paying money? Can you get to the top levels of knowledge of the church and pay no money?
Yes, you can. I can answer that first of all. But also I want to address one thing. I have read most of her book, and here I am.
You're not a suppressive person.
Exactly. Yes, you can.
So if I wanted to take all the levels of training of Scientology, I could do it and just live my life as a news reporter outside Scientology, go in and get this stuff for free, and then I would learn everything about Scientology without having to pay a cent.
Okay, the contributions for public parishioners are different than for me as a staff member. My training and my counseling in the Church of Scientology is free. Parishioners do exchange with the church for the services that they receive.
Well, that was Pat Harney, a spokesperson for the Church of Scientology 3 years ago on this radio station, along with Brett Miller, who's a public member of the church. And we're talking about a protest against the church that takes place all this week in Pinellas County. It's called Flag Down. We've got 3 members of a group that are critical of the church, the Flag Down 2014 group. Here in the studio is Chris Shelton, who's a former member, John Sweeney, who's a journalist based in England, and Pete Griffiths, who's a former member. So let me get your comments about, first of all, Chris and Pete and John, the size of the church. There's some dispute. We heard Pat Harney say millions of members, and then we heard a quote from a book that said about 25,000 members. Which is it? Do we know?
Well, the 25,000 figure is much more closer to reality than millions. I have personally held in my hand the list of International Association of Scientologists members. And I have also seen statistical graphs of that the church keeps of attendees at the churches. They keep close monitoring every single week of how many people are on courses or how many people are receiving counseling. Every single week they have to report these figures, and these figures are gathered up from every church around the world every Thursday. I've seen these graphs, right? They graph them, and the figures are nowhere close to millions. They're not even close to tens of thousands. When we're talking about, these figures that she's spewing right now.
Mm-hmm. And Pete, do you want to comment about anything that you heard in that interview there?
Well, I'd like to comment on just about everything, really, especially Janet Reitman's flawed research. She quoted that she'd got some figures from Trinity College, and Trinity College is renowned for its impeccable research. So, I mean, I don't know. I would agree with Chris entirely. If you do look with your own eyes, you can see what's in front of your eyes, and you do not see expanding exponentially churches of Scientology. You see quite the opposite.
What about the cost of being a member? I think there's some confusion as to whether or not you have to pay the church in order to stay in the church.
That was something else as well. Yeah. In theory, a staff member will get the courses and things for free. However, there's a price to pay, and the price to pay is working for no money. I personally worked for months and months on end with no wages whatsoever. In addition to that, if you do leave, they present you with a bill for every single thing you ever got. So again, that's used as a kind of a cosh or a weapon to keep you there. Again, it's they call themselves a church. In my opinion, we're dealing with a criminal syndicate.
Well, why do you say criminal? Because they didn't pay you for the work that you did?
Well, that's part of it. There are labour laws in every country. But in addition to that, there's, as Chris mentioned earlier, there are human rights abuses. But in countries like France and Belgium, they have been taken to court and convicted of fraud, extortion, practicing medicine without a license, spying, invasion of privacy. And these are crimes that are continuing every day, right now, downtown Clearwater at the big building they've got there. Mm-hmm. It's happening right now, right under everyone's noses, and that's why we're here.
There's one thing the church said. By the way, the church says about me, to be fair, that I am psychotic, and a church blogger said I'm genuinely evil. They say I'm a bigot and a liar. But they also regularly send somebody who hasn't to my house Scientology paperwork, and I suspect. I don't know for a fact, but I suspect that the person who doesn't live at my house and hasn't lived there for 10 years in London is listed as a member of the Church of Scientology, which means that I am one of those millions of people who are in it. But we're missing something here, and it's this. Let's talk about space aliens. If you walk into a Christian church, they'll tell you about the baby Jesus. You walk into a mosque, they'll tell you, follow the prophet. You go to a synagogue, marry a nice Jewish girl, don't eat bacon sandwiches. I'm joking, but you get my drift.
Right.
I've been to...
It's pretty simple, straightforward.
You go... I have been to the Tibetan side of the Indian side of the Tibetan Himalayas, and I've met the Dalai Lama, and they will tell you, honor the Dalai Lama and his, glory to the jewel and the heart of the lotus. If you enter a Church of Scientology, you can do it right now in Clearwater, wherever, they will not tell you that 75 million years ago, a space alien Satan called Lord Zenu brought space aliens to Earth and massacred them inside volcanoes with hydrogen bombs. And the only organization that can clear you from being infected by the souls of these dead space aliens is the Church of Scientology. The problem here is simple. Is that a religion, for it to be truly a religion, and this is the British test, it must be open and honest about what it believes in. And Scientology hides that, including from its own members, until you've paid an awful lot of money or spent an awful lot of time in it. And a religion that hides its core belief is not, in the British test, a religion. It's something else.
But here in the U.S., people can worship whatever they want. If they want to believe in space aliens, if they want to believe in Xenu, they have the right to...
And they have the right to do that in Britain too, and I support and defend that right. And having been undercover to North Korea, it's entirely wrong that there are no churches or mosques or temples or even churches of Scientology in Pyongyang. That may sound weird, but I believe that. However, I think there's a difference perhaps between a belief system and a religion. Belief system, anybody can believe in anything. Fine, go ahead. But the question is, once you've got a religion shields you from things like taxation and scrutiny. So the question is this: should an organization that isn't open about what it believes in, and according to ex-members does real harm, and according to ex-members has some kind of thought reform, or what in Britain we call brainwashing, and in the States too, should that have the right to be masked from and shielded from scrutiny and taxation?
Chris, I want to ask you about the taxation question too, because the Church of Scientology was not always considered to be a nonprofit religion by the IRS. That change came in the 1980s, I believe.
93.
1993.
Yeah.
So do we know what prompted the IRS to change its position about the Church of Scientology?
Well, there's some debate about that. I'm not in the inner circle where I can say for sure how that was brought about. I mean, there's, maybe they got something on the IRS or whatever. I don't really know. In 1993, things changed, and the church was suddenly given.
This was after a private meeting between the IRS commissioner and a top official of the church, right?
That's right. Yeah, it was David Miscavige.
It wasn't done in public.
No, it was very much behind the scenes, and it was very sudden when it came, and we were all very surprised by it, and it changed things quite a bit for the church. But on the point that John's bringing up, and that Pete has mentioned to answer on your last question as well, in terms of why do we use the word criminal. Right now in Texas, in Como County, Texas, there is a case of stalking and harassment against a former member's wife, who was never a Scientologist, right? Marty Rathman was, second in the line. His wife, now Monique, never involved with Scientology at all. Scientology goes out of their way to stalk and harass her. And here's an interesting point on this, that on this religious point, is because the church, because they have religious recognition now, are able to hide behind the First Amendment and use the First Amendment as a defense for the criminal activities of stalking and harassment. And I think that is where things go really off the rails for this organization, and why its religiosity should be called into question.
Well, let's take some phone calls from listeners. Our phone number, 813-239-9663. Our email address is dj@wmnf.org. We're talking about the Flag Down Conference that takes place this week in Pinellas County. There are events beginning this afternoon and going all week, including a protest outside the Church of Scientology headquarters in Clearwater on Saturday. 813-239-9663. Let's go to Matt, who's in Land O'Lakes. Matt, you're on the program. What would you like to ask our guests?
Oh, thanks very much, Rob. Good morning to you and your guests. Now, I've read over the years that perhaps one of the tenets of Scientology is to set up headquarters near the coastline, near water. My question being, I went down to the island of Veneer a couple of years back here, and one of their cruise ships came in, large ship with their emblem on the bow, and exactly 3 people got off, a woman in uniform, and then 2 guys who I assume finished the clearing program. And then the following time, I went back to the island a year or 2 later. I spoke to some of my friends that I've met on the island, and they said, sure, they're back. They come ashore. They bring their music there. I guess Korea and the jazz people. My question, in a big way, do they have designs on the island of Bonaire? Which would be terrible. Because
Matt, remind us where Bonaire is.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's in the Dutch Caribbean, southern part of the Caribbean, not far from Venezuela.
Do any of the 3 of you know?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. I find it amusing and striking that only 3 people got off the ship. Mm-hmm. Because, for example, if London, you stand outside the main Church of Scientology, or rather the most well-known place on the Tottenham Court Road, it's nearly always empty. There's a couple of Scientologists inside it, and it's a very public street. Millions of people will go across that over the years, and hardly anybody goes in. And so when ex-Scientologists, and I can only rely upon their word, say, actually, our orgs, our these meeting halls or whatever they have around the world, they're empty nearly all of the time. That's entirely consistent with my own observations of my own 2 eyeballs, and I trust my eyes, I'm afraid to say. So when that bloke who I've never met says, I've only seen sort of 3 people get off a cruise ship, that makes me think that perhaps the church isn't as powerful and hasn't got the money, millions of supporters it says it does.
Matt, did you have reason to believe that there were people on that cruise ship beyond the 3?
No. It was a large ship. I was guessing it would hold 500 plus people, and of course it struck me as so strange that only 3 people got off, and apparently the rest were unable to. My way of thinking held something like a hostage. But as I mentioned, so very strange. I remember back in the 70s going to Clearwater. And a friend and I, we were turning our necks trying to figure out why everybody, frankly, looked like a zombie. Let me thank your guest right now and hope everybody appreciates the fact just how dangerous cults are getting, and thanks, particularly now that things can be bad and people are reaching for something. But what they're doing is just amazing.
All right, Matt.
Amazing.
Matt, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Rob.
Let me ask Pete Griffiths and Chris Shelton and John Sweeney, our guests. Are people held against their will in the Church of Scientology? And Chris, you work for the Sea Org. I would imagine that would be a place where that would happen. And if they are held against their will, how are they held? How are people restrained?
Well, it's interesting. To some degree, you hold yourself in place. And John's book is called The Church of Fear. And they use fear as a weapon. If you leave Scientology and you're going to be presented with a bill for $500,000, you don't want to leave because you don't want to pay the $500,000 bill. But they've got other angles on the fear thing as well. One of the things that they promise you in Scientology is eternity. Now, this might sound a little crazy, but they do. And if you leave Scientology, you're going to lose your eternity, and that's so much to put at risk. Going back to what Matt said about the ship, There are stories, if anybody wants to do the research. I don't know the exact names of the people right now, but there are people who have been held on that ship, captive and prisoners, and the reason they only saw 3 people is probably because the other 500 are held below decks. Slightly jocular.
Chris,
and that actually does occur. We're not talking about physical restraints. John, the power of the mind control in the situation is intense, and it's actually, if it's almost hard to put into words if you haven't lived it. But when Pete talks about your eternity, this is not a casual belief in Scientology. The people in Scientology believe that they are eternal spiritual beings and that their only hope and salvation is to do the processes of Scientology all the way through to the upper levels. And if you don't get to those upper levels, you will not gain spiritual freedom, and therefore you will not gain your eternity, and you will be doomed to repeat life over and over again.
Were the upper levels of Scientology the same when L. Ron Hubbard was alive as they are today?
No. In fact, there have been revisions and changes to them, and that's one of the points of controversy about the purity of Hubbard's writings versus what's there now.
Now, why would they expand the upper levels?
Well, they found what they tell people is they found errors or inconsistencies, or some bad guy got hold of them and did something to them and altered them for the worst, and this sort of thing.
But it's about money.
It is all about money.
The answer to your question is about money. But fundamentally, there is a wall of fire operating Thetan level 3, and that tells you about space aliens. Now, the thing is that if you tell anybody about Lord Zenu, that can cause you mortal danger and your listeners. And I've done 2 programs on Scientology, both in Britain, got 5 million viewers each. And I did that first in 2007, and I am still alive. There's nothing wrong with me. I drink too much. Apart from that, I'm fine. And therefore, I'm living proof, I would argue, that the fundamental thing about the Church of Scientology is nonsense.
L. Ron Hubbard was a science fiction writer, but he was pretty well read. Did he read about, was he also familiar with the techniques of brainwashing or mind control?
Yes, he wrote a manual on that, in fact, around 1955, called the Manual of Brainwashing. I can say for myself, it's true for me, that he wrote it. It's written in his style, and there are words that are used in the Manual of Brainwashing that are very Hubbard-esque, and I'm very familiar with that man's writing. So, yes, he was very familiar with the subject of brainwashing, and he talked about it at length in the early years of Dianetics and Scientology.
Now, the Church deny brainwashing, and it's a loaded term. However, it describes something. Now, like when you go to North Korea, you will meet people who will tell you things that you just know are not true, but they have no other source of information. What's weird about the Church of Scientology and other cults, but we're talking about this one right now, they deny it's a cult, but ex-members say it is a cult, that you've got this thing where it does feel as though their brains have been washed.
Brett, or rather, I spoke with Brett Miller, who is an out member of the Church of Scientology, and I asked him, by reading Janet Reitman's book, was he violating any of the church tenets? And Pete Griffiths, let me ask you, are members of the church allowed to read criticism of the church? Because Brett said that he was allowed, and we also heard from the spokesperson for the church, who said that she was allowed. But are people who are inside the church allowed to read criticism?
Well, I can tell you from my own experience. I was in Scientology in 1987, and on one particular day, I was actually told, this was in the UK, by the way, I was actually told not to watch a certain BBC Panorama programme that was going out that night. The same person he was like the kind of the in-charge guy. He also told us not to read a book written by an author called Russell Miller, who will actually be at the conference tomorrow. So for him to say that, it could be true from his point of view, but it's absolutely not true from my point of view. We were told what we could and what we couldn't read. We were actually encouraged not to read newspapers because it would be healthy, because all they do is contain bad news and stuff you don't really need to know anyway, which could be possibly true. However, with all the bad press about Scientology these days, I imagine that they're telling people not to read newspapers for a different reason.
Well, we're talking about the Flag Down Conference, Flag Down 2014, that begins today in Pinellas County. Our guests are Pete Griffiths, whose voice we just heard there, and before that we heard John Sweeney, author of the book The Church of Fear Inside the Weird World of Scientology, and Chris Shelton is here, a former member of the church. Let's go back to the phones. Our phone number, 813-239-9663. And let's go to Chris in Clearwater. Chris, what's your question for our guests?
I got a point and a couple questions real quick. First is that on the Citizens Committee for Human Rights, I'm not sure if I'm saying that, CCHR, I tend to agree with a lot of their work on the anti-pharmaceutical stance that they're often prescribed without proper diagnoses. But, of course, any organization has good points. That's how they attract their members. And I compliment you after so long, after 25 years of being able to get out of the organization and see the incredible imbalance of negative to positive. And my questions are, what do you think of the validity of xenu.net, xenu.net, of how they release the scripture, as you might call them, of Scientology to those who don't have the money to pay? And isn't auditing, do you think that auditing is a form of confession in order to extort and blackmail members to prevent them from leaving?
All right. Chris, thank you for your questions.
Yes. One, to answer the first question, xenu.net is, as far as I know, a reliable source of information for the confidential scriptures of the church. I've spoken with people who've seen those scriptures when they were in the church, saw them out on the internet, said, yes, that's what it is. As to the auditing, there is a kind of confessional procedure that occurs in the church that is very much used as a form of mind control. I'm not under the impression that all auditing is mind control, but the confessionals specifically, where you're told to, you're asked what bad things you have done, and you're specifically asked very specific questions about
how deep does it go? Do they find out every bad thing you've ever done?
Yes, they actually do, and to the tune of exact time, exact place, exactly what you did.
Is that information ever used against you if you leave the church?
Yes, it is. It's all written down and kept in worksheets, which are kept in folders, and your name is on those folders. And I personally have 50 folders worth of confessional worksheets. Okay. I received, hundreds of hours of these confessionals, and every single aspect of your life is put under a microscope and recorded down. And then it is used against you if you leave the church.
And that includes sex. Who
Very
were you
much
sleeping
so.
with? What was she wearing? What was he wearing? What did you do to him, her? What did she do to her, you? Now, I don't know, because I've never been a Scientologist, but ex-members of the church, including some who were in Hollywood, have told me that's true. They also say they love bomb you to death to begin with. So there's no mousetrap, which a mousetrap to work has got to have good cheese in it. And so clearly there are things, for example, one of the callers talked about the CCHR has serious questions about the pharmaceutical industry. Well, those questions may be spot on. There are big questions to ask about the pharmaceutical industry and what it does. But at the same time, what is the motive? What is the what's driving the CCHR? It was the CCHR museum into psychiatry. It's where I lost my temper, where I went nuts. Now, there's something strange about this organization, because it champions human rights, but not, it seems, for members or ex-members of the Church of Scientology. There's a guy called Bruce Hines. He spent 6 years in the rehabilitation project force, the RPF, and he described, he was in a desert in California, in a shed, and it got up to more than 100 degrees. It was incredible. And he says there were times when after I left, I read a definition of brainwashing by an American psychiatrist who treated American prisoners of war who'd been brainwashed in North Korea by the Chinese communists. And he read, this guy is called Professor Lifton, and Lifton's test of brainwashing, and he said, I would realize now that I was brainwashed. That man audited Tom Cruise. the church deny this, they say, I'm a bigot, psychotic, and a liar. I like to say that's my little mantra.
Pete, before we go back to the phones, I want to ask you, what are some of the events that are happening this week, and what's the website, too?
Well, we are essentially having people such as ourselves. We'll be talking, we'll be live streaming the event. We'll also be making a video record of everything so that it goes into the record forever, for eternity, you might say. And in addition to the Monday and Tuesday that we're having down at Minreg Hall, we'll be also organising a tour of various Scientology locations. We're going to have a little beach party as well, and then we're going to close the whole thing off on Friday with something very special. So that's what we have lined up.
And then you plan on...
Website.
What's the website?
The website is 3wsflagdown.org. O-R-G.
And you're planning to protest outside the church in Clearwater?
A lot of the organising of this has been done in conjunction with local people who prefer to remain anonymous, and the protest itself is largely organised by those people rather than us. We're not separate exactly, but we're not particularly concerned with the protest itself, although we will attend, because we want to make our feelings known. So.
Is the movement of ex-members, are there a lot of ex-members these days?
Oh, yes, I think we're growing exponentially. Yeah.
Let's go back. Echoing Pat Harney. Let's go back to Chris. Thank you very much for your phone call. Let's go to Mike, who's listening online in Maine. Mike, what's your question for our guests?
Thank you, Chris and John and Pete. Could any of you address the question of disconnection?
Yes.
What is disconnection?
Disconnection is a policy where the church does not allow members to be in communication with former members, ex-members who have spoken out or somehow have a problem with the church or somehow have communicated, discontent. They are called suppressive people. And it's a formal declaration that the church issues on a person. It's the version of a Scientology bad guy. And if you are found connected with that person in any way, including if that person is, say, writing a book or writing blog articles and you read them, that means you're connected to that person in Scientology's way of thinking, which is why they can't go on the internet and can't read the books. You yourself will be declared a suppressive person if you're found to be connected to these people. That is church policy. It's undeniable. It's irrefutable. It's in their books.
Mike, does that answer your question?
It does indeed. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. Thank you very much. And let's go to Joshua in Clearwater. Joshua, you're on. What's your question?
How you doing? I grew up as a son of OT8. I'm the stepson of an OT8, and my father's been a long-time Scientologist. And my parents got divorced when I was young, so I grew up half on my mom's side as a Christian, and then would come over to the Scientology life. And then when I was 12 years old, I was actually sent to a place called the Mace Kingsley Ranch School in New Mexico, where I was kept for 3 years. Wow. And I was digging ditches and bucking hay, and they would feed us out of slop buckets a lot of times. And I got no education. I left there, and I tried to get transcripts. I went to Alaska to be with my mother and had transcripts from this Mace Kingsley Ranch School so that I could go to high school. And they were all fake. The transcripts were fake. They said there's no record of you being in school since you're 11 years old. And I was basically robbed of a childhood and an education. And now here I am, 34 years old, and my life is extremely difficult and very tough. And my parents are doctors. My dad's he's a doctor in an emergency room, and my stepmother owns a medical practice, and they have, they're fortunate to have a lot of money. And my life has just been complete crap.
Do you have a relationship with your parents?
I try to, but it's hard because I'm not a Scientologist.
Yeah. Joshua, thank you. We're down to the last 30 seconds. Chris, what would you say just in 20 seconds or so?
I would say very quickly that it's a shame that there is more than a little bit of a record with Scientologists of this situation occurring with their children. I've run into it over and over again through the years of basically a negligent situation.
And I'm sorry to say we're out of time. Chris Shelton, former member of the Church of Scientology, thank you very much. John Sweeney, author of the book, The Church of Fear, Inside the Weird World of Scientology. Nice to meet you. Thank you for coming by.
Thank you.
And Pete Griffiths, organizer of Flag Down 2014, thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you want to comment about today's show, call us up at 813-238-8001. Record your comment on extension 115. We'll play those comments back at the top of the show tomorrow at 11 a.m. Stay tuned for Democracy Now! Coming up next, this is WMNF, Tampa, St. Petersburg. We're going to go up to Washington, D.C. right now and get the latest news.